Welcome, one and all. It's the No Name Cinema Society. After exactly 4 weeks, we are back to talk about several different movies, starting tonight with Bridge of Spies, which came out this past weekend. Since you last saw me, I've been to New York and back already. That's how long it's been. Got my beer that I'm ready to drink to kick tonight off. And this beer is specifically chosen because of tonight's indie, and we'll talk about that for those of you that are going to stay long enough to watch the indie.
So how many of those have you had tonight?
Spotlight. This is the first one. This is the first one. You're not saying anything. I haven't introduced you yet, so you can't say anything. So first up, my co-host, as always. Let me introduce you to my good friend Dave Joseph. How you feeling tonight, Dave?
I'm doing well. How's it going?
It's going okay. Dave, your other claim to fame is that you are currently last place in our fantasy football league. Any comments at this time?
Well, Stafford had a good week, so I
mean,
hope
you're so bad. You're so bad that even though you had a great week, you're still 100 points out of next to last place.
Well, I'm playing for next year. I'm getting that first pick.
Last place in our league gets first pick in the subsequent year's draft. So
thank God it's not a tattoo league.
Yeah, Davey, you can start thinking about who you're going to pick as your first pick in the draft next year. Now, Davey is the one that started this whole show, and one of the things I think that he was thinking about when bringing me and my other panelist on is a famous story that connects to tonight's broadcast. Is a famous argument, intense argument, had on New Year's Eve in 2004 heading into 2005 about the merits of Steven Spielberg versus M. Night Shyamalan, and I argued the side of the good. I argued light, as opposed to our hater, Prince of Darkness over here, J Money, who argued the M. Night Shyamalan side of things, infamously, I should say. And David, that's one of the things that led you, in addition to Film Revision, I imagine, that led you to bring us back together.
That is absolutely correct. And I'm glad that maybe we can rehab tonight. See if anyone's changed their mind.
Well, it will be interesting. So, J Money, how are you today? Welcome back to the show.
I'm sick, but otherwise I'm good. It's good to be back.
Do you mean that?
Do I mean that literally? Am I sick? Yeah.
Especially after that, like Prince of Darkness intro.
No. You call it like you see it. I understand how that is.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's time to talk about the reason that it was important is tonight's film is The Bridge of Spies, latest film from Steven Spielberg, and so that's why the Spielberg versus Shyamalan conversation came into play. So I think J Money has circled this date in our calendar for a long time.
I'm not quite as much of a hater as you think, and I'd like to point out something, JB.
Okay.
That argument was 15 years ago at this point. And that was, I don't know, what is that, 5 movies from where we are now with Shyamalan?
Shyamalan, yeah. Maybe 10 movies from Spielberg, but
century where there was still some brightness.
It was only 10 years ago.
Yeah, it was only 10 years ago. Unfortunately, it's also a lifetime ago for his career. So it's a point where you could hope for something happening with the situation. And frankly, my opinion about Spielberg hasn't changed in that time frame. So
now you hate them both.
Well, now I feel like they're both a little hacky, yeah.
Okay, so that's a good segue to kick us off. Bridge of Spies, ladies and gentlemen. It's a true story of a Brooklyn attorney in the late 50s, as played by Tom Hanks, who defended Rudolf Abel, a Russian spy at the height of the Cold War. And then this attorney, played by Tom Hanks, negotiated the prisoner swap with the Russians for Abel and Francis Gary Powers, pictured here, the U-2 pilot who was famously shot down in 1960. So that's the summary. Did that about cover it, gentlemen?
That works for me.
Yeah.
I feel good about that. It's time for opening thoughts. Davey, you're first.
I thought this was vintage Spielberg. I thought he nailed it again. I really liked the movie. It was sort of deliberately paced, but interesting enough to survive it, and it was it was just another great performance by Tom Hanks, and I want to really hate a movie because it's a lot more fun, but I didn't get that chance this time around, so no, I liked it a lot.
J Money.
It was good. It was a competent movie. I don't really have a lot of passion for it, but other than that, it was a solid movie to see with your parents.
And I also would use the word interesting, but I would also add that it's interesting but not engaging. Was a sort of general feeling I had about it. And I think let's start there because I mean, and normally I start with the positives, but I mean like. For as compelling as it was sometimes, I want to dig under what didn't work for me. And one of the first things that I maybe want to talk about is, and it's generally a problem. I think it's what J Money rejects in a lot of Spielberg that sometimes he gets away with, and in this film I don't know if he does, and that's moments of extreme heavy-handedness.
Yes.
So that's where I'm starting with here, and I mean I've got a number of examples. J Money, what do you think about that concept to begin with, or like that through line?
That's certainly correct in terms of how I think about it. I mean, my level in terms of evaluating Spielberg is always on a scale of schmaltiness, 1 to 10 of schmaltz, because he's certainly guilty of doing that at certain times. There are certain movies where he kind of shoehorns a lot of unnecessary, I don't know, sentimentality, or maybe a lot of unnecessary flash, a lot of unnecessary sort of stylistic decisions that I think are questionable. In this movie, I actually didn't feel like there was too much of that going on. There were a couple moments that made me, cringe a little bit, but it's all acceptable for the situation. So.
Well, I mean, like the word that I would argue, and and like we're going to talk more about Spielberg later on in our sound off when I'm actually going to do a top 5. But I think that the word that I cling on to in that little speech you just made is unnecessary. Most of the time, I would argue that it's not unnecessary. This film, it's almost, I don't know if I'm disagreeing with you or not, because you're saying you didn't feel that a lot. I felt that a lot with this film, and some particular moments, like there was a moment that we cut to the Pledge of Allegiance, just randomly, a random Pledge of Allegiance in the middle of nowhere. That didn't ring true for me. The Berlin Wall scene where they're passing through the Berlin Wall and there's people trying to climb over it. I don't want to give too much away, but then it's echoed again at the end of the movie where people are trying to climb over a Brooklyn gate.
I knew you would hate that.
Well, don't you, J Money, hate that?
Yeah, well, I guess at this point I would say I don't hate that kind of stuff because it's what I expect to some degree. I guess it wasn't. I didn't find the things that were happening that we're talking about in this movie as heavy-handed as some of the things he did in, say, Munich, which I know is going to come up later. There were other things that he's done which I feel like
you don't know that for a fact, but it will if you bring it up. But
I'm sure it'll come up in conversation one way or the other. Because I feel like this movie is also indicative of a lot of other things that he's done recently, and they all kind of blend together in a way that I find generic, which is part of the problem I have with him trying to bring things, I think.
I felt like there's far less objectionable in this way in terms of heavy-handedness in Munich. Munich, I feel like, is a lot darker and has a lot more gravitas, and I did not feel that Munich was pushing like an agenda in the same way that this and Lincoln were. And the frustration, I think...
I would disagree with that statement a little bit. I felt like this one definitely had a strongly, almost silly, a patriotic bent to it, in a sort of, this is your Hallmark card about the 4th of July kind of way. There was a quality to it, which I understand, it's hard to say how I'm
well,
trying
that's exactly what I expected. That's exactly the sentimentality that didn't seem to work here, that did certainly work very well in his earlier career when he was taking on more personal stories. And again, we'll talk about that later, but I think the sentimentality in some of his earlier works, when it was just like, A Boy and His Alien, for example,
yeah.
Like that works a lot better, I think, than when you're dealing with, these sort of grand stories. Like, for example, this whole concept of due process being important, or, I felt like, first of all, it was overdone, and then it disappeared in the movie. Like, it was like the common thrust of this movie of this idea of a spy getting due process, in spite of the fact that he's a traitor and all these other things. that was like the common thrust of the movie, and then it's gone, and then it's not a part of the movie at all. And it was so, banged over the head for the first 45 minutes that, the sentimentality doesn't feel right because it's a grander issue versus these sort of, and it's not as personal. You know what I mean? It's more, it's more of a concept.
But it's funny because you're saying things about other movies that he's done for the last 15 years, or at least how I feel about the other movies he's done for the last 15 years. So I just wonder if there's, where's the line for each of us on this? Because for me, at this point, like what I saw here was not as bad to me as some of the other things, and I guess I kind of expect that a certain level of that in all his movies. So I'm willing to, I'm willing to be okay with what happened in this one, for instance. Whereas, it sounds like for you, this one really reached the line, and you can't deal with it.
Well, I mean, like, it certainly had those moments, and that's what we focused on. But it had some great moments as well that I want to talk about in a second. But before I do, off camera, Davie Joe asked me about the structure, and I think that's interesting as well. So I wanted to get this before I get to the good things. I wanted to talk about the structure. Davie Joe, what is it that you noticed that you felt like?
Well, it was just sort of an academic question that I defer to you on these things. I didn't know whether you would call it a fourth act, the whole spy swap angle, and then the third act being the resolution of the original case. I don't know how you would diagram the movie, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, it's a problem because I don't know either, and I think that's something that bothered me about the movie as well. Is it felt a little, it felt like two movies. I mean, like, there is the Rudolph Abel section, and like in theory, a screenwriter or Spielberg can argue, well, you need that section in order to get to know Abel, in order to have stakes when you're talking about the swap, but they skipped over, like, Abel's actual initial trial was glossed over completely. They just jumped straight to the verdict. And I mean, like, I understand the need to do that in the sense, like, well, you need to, like, it would make it a 3-hour movie instead of a 2-hour and 20-minute movie. Like, I mean, I understand the need for economics there, but at the same time, it felt very disjointed. Maybe we don't need to see the cross-cutting, and this was also overdone as well in terms of, like, a little heavy-handed, the cross-cutting between Abel and Powers. Like, he would even, like, do fades where Abel was on one side of the screen and then Powers would be on the other, sort of connecting them in the space in a very, like, film student-y kind of way. And so structurally, maybe that's the part that we didn't need so that we could see more of the story. I don't know. My issue with both this and Lincoln is they seem a little sprawling. These last couple films seem so, heavy-handed at times, and like their issues are obvious. Like, yeah, I mean, like, the slavery was bad, and due process is important. Like, these are things that are obvious and not, complicated issues. Like, the things that we like, a film that we have not talked about as a group, but a film like Sicario, for example, has issues that are extremely complicated and not as, like, obvious, and therefore, like, watching the film is a little more engaging, I think.
Yeah, but Jimmy, I mean, I don't want to get too much into other movies he's done, but I guess I feel like what you're describing is the way that he kind of approaches historical fiction or historical whatever movies in general.
Maybe.
I mean, I would say that what you're describing is also how Schindler's List was, for instance. I feel like all his movies that have to deal with any kind of historical context end up being pretty flat. They end up being pretty straightforward.
Well, I certainly disagree about Schindler's List. I mean, I feel like that that is a film that does a great job of. It has two characters, and it sort of follows along the way, and it does it compares and contrasts them in different ways. That is powerful.
There's certainly no surprise, really, with either character. I think that, like, for instance, with this movie.
But I think they're both three-dimensional, and
I agree.
Really get that.
They're both good characters. I'm just saying that it's also just a very straightforward movie. I would say with this one, specifically in terms of the way that it felt like structured like two different movies, because of the way that it was structured to begin with, I was expecting there to be an arc for Tom Hanks' character, whose name I'm blanking on right this second, for the second part of this movie. I was expecting him to kind of break through his
Jim something.
Yeah. I was expecting him to break through sort of the Boy Scout mold that he was presenting himself as in the first act, or the first half, really, and to kind of, sort of understand a practical understanding of the world in a more nuanced and sophisticated way by the end of the movie, and I don't feel like that happened. So I kind of left the theater wondering, like, I don't really know what entirely the point of it was. And, frankly, since it's based on a true story, that's just not how life works anyway. So, I don't know if that's part of the reason that happened. I don't know if Spielberg just doesn't really feel a need to kind of address those kind of issues, or...
Yeah, and I also feel like, in that sense, the movie lacked real drama. I mean, like,
Yeah.
I felt like it lacked... And I mean, like, there are good things about the movie that I guess we're about to get to, but it was interesting. I'm a history buff, so I'm like, I found it very interesting and compelling. But I mean, it's very plot driven, and I think where Schindler's List was successful for me, and it wasn't successful for you, but where Schindler's List was successful for me, that this movie wasn't, is I felt like the characters were very complex in Schindler's List. It wasn't like White Hat and Black Hat necessarily. I mean, like, Amos Goeth in Schindler's List is evil, but I mean, like, he has, sides to him, and just like Schindler's List is not completely Oscar Schindler's not completely good. I feel like Jim, as we'll call him, Jim the lawyer, is, like, he is that Boy Scout guy that doesn't have the edge that you want from, like, a Spielberg movie. He's the righteous indignation guy that Tom Hanks has made a career doing, and also Denzel Washington you can throw in that category of guys that, are always standing up for righteous indignation and, and getting awards for it. But it's, it left this movie something to be desired. Before I move on to the good stuff, Davey Joe, how do you respond to all that?
Yeah, well, I mean, definitely he is the Boy Scout in the movie, and there is no character flaw. I kind of like that. Basically he's the babyface in the movie, and everyone else is kind of got a heel aspect to them. I mean, even the person he's representing is a spy against the United States. The CIA is kind of working against him a little bit in some areas. The judge is kind of working against him in some areas. So I mean, he's kind of a good foil to just the rest of the world. But I get it. It does lack a certain complexity when the main character is perfect.
And I mean, I wanted to talk about something else first, but since we're talking about Tom Hanks, then the next thing I can segue to performances, because one of the strengths of the film, I think, are actually performances. Overall, I mean, I think performances in Spielberg films are underrated. I think that he's not known as a performance-driven director like somebody like Martin Scorsese is, but I mean, I think that there's very rarely, if ever, bad performances in any Spielberg films. And I mean, like Spike Lee had a line once where he says, an actor always gets credit for a great performance, but a director always gets blamed for a bad performance. And I think there's some truth in that. But it's interesting. Like, if you look across the board and see a movie with solid performances across the board, the director needs to get credit for that. And I feel like, like, I could do a great. I'm doing a top 5 later tonight of Spielberg films. I could do a great top 5 of best performances in Spielberg films, and I think people would forget, like, oh yeah, that was an awesome performance. And like, these performances, I think, are underrated. We now have one person that's won an Oscar for a Spielberg film, but only one. And point being that I think that across the board, I don't think there's a false note in any performances. Even though the character is written of Jim might be a little two-dimensional, I don't think he has a false moment.
No, I didn't have a problem with the performance, but I guess that's what you're saying. It's Tom Hanks couldn't sleepwalk through that performance at this point. Like, everybody just kind of hit their marks in a way that you expected them to.
But what about performances overall? I mean, I think my point is the performances are one of the strengths of this movie.
I liked all the performances overall. Like I'm saying, overall, it's a fine film. It is a fine film to me. It's just not the most compelling film. It's not necessarily the most interesting, as you put it. But everybody was doing their job well, I think, especially what's his face,
Mark Rylance, who's pictured now.
Mark Rylance. great. I mean, I really enjoyed that performance. I really enjoyed sort of his taciturn attitude in general. I really enjoyed, how some of the side characters were portrayed. Yeah, look, in general, I don't have any problem, especially with what you're saying with other Spielberg movies, with the performances. If anything, to me, the performances are usually what saves a movie, if it can be saved.
Right. So, okay, and James, what about you, Davy Joe?
No, the performances were fine. Tom Hanks, I don't know if I'm just kind of like a mark for Tom Hanks, but
Did you say a martyr?
Mark.
Mark.
Sorry, I'm throwing out the wrestling terms tonight. I like him. The idea, I've been around a lot of lawyers, and sort of the older grizzled guys that have been in court a lot. He just it rang true to me, so.
Yeah, let's not talk about Tom Hanks. Tom Hanks.
Do you have like a specific lawyerly perspective on this film? Like, do you want to tackle it from that vantage point before I move on to the next topic?
I can say that the due process issue is very complicated in the sense that when you're talking about non-citizens and arguable enemy combatants. It's a real.
So do you feel like the judge in the movie, because the way the movie paints it is that the judge and everyone else, they're basically a mob, and they're all wrong. That's how I feel like the movie is trying to portray that Tom Hanks is like Gary Cooper in High Noon against this, or maybe Gregory Peck against the town To Kill a Mockingbird. That's how it sort of feels. That's how it sort of feels like it's being portrayed.
He didn't make any compelling arguments. I think that there were ways of making his arguments, a little more legal in nature. Calling him an enemy combatant or something like that, saying that he shouldn't be afforded rights.
I mean, this is law today. You're not necessarily aware of what the law would have been in 1957.
Yeah, probably there was a time when I read the cases and could put years on them, but
I'm just saying the law could have changed in terms of some of these loopholes that you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely it's changed somewhat with situations with terrorists.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so we don't have a lot of time left. One other thing that I wanted to give the movie credit for is, and I also we have some viewers. I just want to say hello to the viewers, and these guys want to say hello. Say hi to the viewers, everybody. That's
Hey.
J Money, Davey Joe. If you've got questions or comments, feel free to post on Facebook or wherever it is you're watching, YouTube, et cetera, et cetera. If you've got something you want to chime in with, please feel free. That would be great. One thing this movie has, as is often in Spielberg films, is it has some outstanding moments of beauty and just great cinematic moments. The downing, and this isn't giving it away. This is a historic moment, but the U-2 being shot down, I thought was so well done. Another moment that comes to mind is Mark Rylance has a speech about the standing man early in the film. Like a monologue in which she simple dolly in. That's our timer, which means time is up. But simple dolly in while he delivers this speech, which I thought was just some great work. The following in the rain scene is another one that comes to mind. Do you guys, before we go, have some moments like that you enjoyed? Davy Joe, you like the film. You first.
I think that the scene in the car when they're speeding through East Berlin, I really.
With Sebastian Koch?
Yeah, and if I was at home, I would have probably watched that again.
Okay. J Money, do you have anything?
I'll echo the whole downing of the U-2 like you're describing. I'd also say, just in terms of setting up Abe's character in the beginning, with different shots of his environments, and then the way that we sort of walk through his environments with him as he's being tailed around, I really enjoyed those sequences.
Cool. All right, so gentlemen, we've got to wrap it up. We're going to be on time for our Indie Spotlight. We've got 5 minutes left. All right, so cool. So that's our producer. I can't tell who liked it more. I know, like, clearly Davey Joe liked it the best. I don't know. It's hard to tell who comes in second, though, me or Jay Money.
I think it's a wash. I think we liked it the same. We just liked it differently.
Okay. All right. Yeah. I mean, yeah. I'm wishy-washy on it. Like I feel similarly. I maybe liked it a little better than Lincoln. Not much though. So anyway. All right. So that's Bridge of Spies. So that's what we got going on now. Our next current feature is going to be on November the 9th, and that is going to be. Get ready for this one. You're going to love it. Spectre! Bond's coming up next time, November the 9th, and that's going to be at 8:30 Eastern, 5:30 Pacific, and that's going to be November the 9th. But before then, in about 4 minutes, we're going to do our Indie Spotlight for the night, which, if you haven't figured out already, is a film from 2010 called The Joneses with David Duchovny and Demi Moore. We're going to break it down coming up in about 5 minutes, and we will see you then.